The ground trembled before the steel beasts arrived. German Panzers, unstoppable, roaring forward, chewing through men and metal alike, rolling symbols of Nazi dominance. Infantry stood no chance, or so everyone thought. But somewhere, in the mud and chaos of Europe, a handful of British soldiers decided they wouldn't run anymore. They reached into their packs and pulled out something that looked more like a plumbing pipe than a weapon, a strange, stubborn piece of genius called the PIAT. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Globe showing Europe, Africa. I love seeing how far our stories reach. And if you love real tales of courage, invention, and impossible odds, hit subscribe and join us for more stories history almost forgot. The year was 1942. The world was burning. Europe was shattered under the iron heel of Nazi Germany. France had fallen in weeks. The skies above Britain still echoed with the ghosts of the Battle of Britain, that desperate summer when radar screens lit up like constellations of death. Across the Atlantic, America was finally in the fight, but the Axis powers still held the upper hand. Every newspaper headline screamed defeat, retreat, or loss. Hope was a rumor, courage, a dwindling resource. On the battlefields of North Africa and the Eastern Front, tanks ruled everything. They were the kings of the new war. The German Panzers, sleek, fast, devastating, rolled across fields and deserts like predators unleashed. Infantry had one order when they heard the rumble: run. Their rifles were useless against armor, their grenades laughable. A tank meant death, and men learned to scatter rather than stand. In the shattered cities of Europe, civilians huddled in basements, listening to that low mechanical growl, a sound that announced their helplessness. Tanks didn't just break defenses, they broke morale. The war machine was psychological as much as physical. To face a panzer was to face a moving fortress that could spit death from 2,000 meters away. And against that, what could a single soldier do? The British Army was painfully aware of this imbalance. Reports from the front lines told the same story again and again: brave men standing their ground, only to be crushed or incinerated under treads and shells. Every attempt to stop tanks, sticky bombs, Molotov cocktails, boys' anti-tank rifles, failed miserably or killed the user. The infantryman was still fighting a 20th century war with the weapons of the 19th. Back home, Churchill's war cabinet read these reports with growing dread. Britain couldn't mass-produce tanks like Germany could. The empire stretched thin, fighting in Africa, Burma, the Mediterranean. So they turned to something else: brains over brawn. Somewhere, somehow, they would need a weapon small enough for a man to carry, yet powerful enough to knock a panzer off its throne. Factories buzzed day and night, engineers worked in secret rooms, and labs filled with strange contraptions, many of which exploded before they even left the table. But deep inside those failures, buried under soot, sparks, and shattered steel, something extraordinary was about to be born. The British had always been known for their stubbornness, for their quiet, unshakable belief that there's always some way out. And in this moment of desperation, when every plan seemed impossible, that very stubbornness became a weapon of its own. Because soon, in the hands of a soldier kneeling in the mud, a man staring down a tank the size of a house, that weapon would roar to life. And it wouldn't come from a factory giant or a famous general. It would come from a man with grease on his hands and madness in his eyes. The war was changing. And somewhere, amidst the chaos and smoke, the story of the PIAT, the weapon no one believed in, was about to begin. By late 1942, the British Army faced a nightmare that no pep talk or Churchill's speech could fix. The German armored divisions were rewriting the rules of war. The Panzer IVs, Tigers and Panthers had become rolling fortresses, monsters of steel that could shrug off artillery and crush infantry like ants. Their 88 guns punched through Allied armor at obscene ranges. The problem wasn't bravery, it was physics. The British simply didn't have a weapon that could stop them. The boys' anti-tank rifle, once hailed as the infantry's tank killer, had become a joke on the battlefield. Its heavy, bolt-action rounds could barely scratch a panzer's paint, and its recoil broke men's shoulders more often than it broke enemy armor. Soldiers joked that it was more dangerous to the shooter than the target. Grenades and Molotovs were acts of desperation, requiring suicidal courage to get close enough to matter. The sticky bomb, that strange gluey contraption, sometimes worked, but more often stuck to the wrong thing, usually the soldier himself. Commanders begged the War Office for a solution. They needed a portable weapon that could pierce German armor, something an infantryman could carry and fire without needing a vehicle or artillery battery. But every proposal seemed impossible. Bazookas, the new American miracle, were still in testing. Rockets were unreliable. Conventional guns couldn't generate enough power without massive recoil. It was as if the very laws of physics were mocking them. The British had always prided themselves on innovation, radar, code-breaking, new tank designs, but this was different. It wasn't just an engineering challenge. It was a philosophical one. How do you give a man on foot the power to destroy a machine that weighs 50 tons? How do you balance the unstoppable with the immovable? Meanwhile, across Europe, German propaganda boasted of their armored invincibility. Film reels showed Panzers storming through villages, their crews laughing as enemy shells bounced off their hulls. Leaflets dropped over Allied lines taunted infantrymen, daring them to bring their pop guns against Hitler's iron beasts. It wasn't just about machines anymore, it was about morale. The very sight of a tank made soldiers freeze. In Britain's secret research labs, the mood was grim. The physicists knew the math didn't work. The metallurgists couldn't invent a lightweight explosive powerful enough to punch through armor. Even the optimists in the Royal Engineers began to doubt that a man-portable anti-tank weapon was possible. "You might as well throw your helmet at it," one officer muttered after another failed test. And yet, buried deep within the chaos, one man was quietly refusing to give up. He wasn't a general or a famous scientist. He didn't even look the part of a war hero. But he had a mind wired for defiance, a man who looked at problems not as barriers, but as puzzles begging to be solved. While others chased rockets and fancy explosives, he stared at a simple spring and saw something no one else did. His name was Major Millers Jeffers, a soldier engineer who believed that if brute force failed, then madness might just succeed. Where others saw impossibility, he saw opportunity. The question haunting Britain, how can a man stop a tank, had an answer. But that answer, when it came, would defy logic, safety, and reason itself. Because Jeffress's solution wasn't elegant, it wasn't safe, and it wasn't sane. But it would work. In a quiet corner of Britain's shadowy world of wartime research, among warehouses filled with half-broken prototypes and chalk-dusted blackboards, one man worked like he was possessed. Major Millers Jeffers was not what anyone imagined when they thought of a military innovator. He wasn't tall, wasn't loud, and didn't command attention in a room, but his mind, restless and volcanic, burned brighter than most of the Empire's laboratories combined. Born into a family that valued logic over luxury, Jeffers had grown up taking things apart just to see how they worked: clocks, carburetors, anything that moved. He was a thinker who distrusted authority, a soldier who didn't like war, and an engineer who believed no problem was ever truly unsolvable. When the war came, he didn't seek glory at the front. He sought solutions in the workshop, and that's where the British Army would find their most unorthodox savior. By 1940, Jeffers had been pulled into the world of MD1, a top-secret weapons lab hidden inside a country estate near Buckinghamshire. It was nicknamed Churchill Toy Shop, a playground for Britain's wildest inventors, men who dreamed of impossible weapons. Mines that crawled, exploding rats, magnetic limpet bombs, ideas so absurd that conventional officers dismissed them as lunacy. But Churchill himself had faith in Jeffers. "Give him what he wants," the Prime Minister had once said, "and stand back." Jeffers thrived in chaos. His lab was a jungle of wires, springs, and half-burnt blueprints. He wore the same stained overalls for days. He chain-smoked as he worked, muttering equations under his breath, his hands blackened with grease. But behind that mess was an extraordinary discipline, a mind that understood the language of energy and recoil, of motion and resistance. To him, the laws of physics were just rules waiting to be bent. The problem of the tank fascinated him. He'd seen what the Germans were doing in France, how entire battalions of infantry were rendered helpless under the grinding treads of panzers. Jeffers understood that the British could never outbuild the Germans in sheer armor. They needed asymmetry, something small, cheap, and terrifyingly effective, something the enemy would never see coming. But when he proposed his idea, a weapon powered not by gunpowder or rockets, but by a massive spring. His colleagues thought he'd lost his mind. Springs were for toys, not weapons. "You'll kill the man firing it before you kill the tank," one officer sneered. Jeffress didn't argue. He simply returned to his desk, lit another cigarette, and began sketching. What he envisioned was crude but revolutionary, a spigot mortar that fired a shaped charge bomb without the need for a conventional barrel. Instead of pressure pushing the projectile forward, it would be launched from behind, detonated by a pin driven through the base. The spring would absorb the recoil, allowing a soldier to fire it without being blown backward. It sounded insane, because it was. But the math whispered that it could work. As the war worsened and hope thinned, Jeffress became more isolated and more obsessed. His peers in other departments chased glory projects. He chased one ugly, stubby device that everyone else wanted buried. But he saw beyond the ridicule. He saw a weapon that could give a single soldier the power to kill a tank. And in the quiet hours, when the world outside the lab was being torn apart, Jeffress would look at his crude sketches and smile to himself. Because he knew, somewhere deep in his bones, that sometimes the line between madness and genius is drawn by victory. It started with a sound, a sharp metallic twang that echoed through the workshop like the laugh of a ghost. Millis Jeffress looked up from his desk, half startled, half delighted. A prototype spring, crude, oversized, wound to impossible tension, had just snapped loose, punching a dent into the far wall and scattering tools across the floor. The technicians cursed. Jeffress just grinned. To everyone else, it was another failure. To him, it was music, the sound of an idea being born. He had been wrestling with the physics for weeks, haunted by the same question: how do you hurl a bomb powerful enough to pierce armor without blowing yourself apart in the process? Rockets were elegant but unreliable. Gunpowder-based mortars needed thick barrels that weighed too much. What if he thought recoil wasn't something to fear, but something you could tame, redirect, even use? That thought, absurd, almost childish, became the seed of madness that would eventually flower into the PIAT. Jeffress called his creation a spigot mortar, though it looked nothing like a weapon. There was no real barrel, just a solid steel rod, the spigot, that a bomb would sit on top of. When fired, a monstrous spring would slam the spigot forward, igniting a small propellant inside the bomb and launching it outward. It was messy, unpredictable, and dangerous, but it might just solve the impossible problem. It didn't rely on fancy manufacturing or scarce materials. It could be built cheaply and carried by one man. His assistants were skeptical, even frightened. The weapon kicked like a mule. The spring alone took 2 men and a lever to compress. During one test, a misfire sent the projectile skidding across the floor, hissing smoke until it exploded under a workbench. They barely escaped with their lives, but Jeffress laughed through the dust. "It moved," he shouted, coughing through the debris. "It moved." That was enough for him, proof that he was on the right path, no matter how absurd it seemed. Word of his suicidal spring gun reached other research departments, and soon the jokes began. Jeffress's jack-in-the-box, they called it, the suicide stick. Officers refused to test it. One general, after hearing about the recoil, said flatly, "I'd rather face the tank." But Churchill, ever the gambler, gave him a thin smile when briefed on the project. "If it works," the Prime Minister said, "you may have just invented the slingshot of the modern David." Encouraged, Jeffress doubled down. He spent nights at the lab, hunched over a workbench littered with springs, fuses, and spent shells. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands bandaged from burns. His wife worried he was losing his mind. He'd murmur formulas in his sleep, waking in a cold sweat, reaching for a notebook to scribble another design change. The weapon was becoming an obsession, a living thing he refused to let die. The breakthrough came not in a lab, but in a moment of sheer frustration. After another failed firing, Jeffress slammed the weapon to the ground, and the spring assembly clicked just so. He froze, looked down, and realized the misalignment that had plagued him for weeks wasn't a flaw, it was a feature, a self-cocking mechanism. That accident would later become one of the PIAT's most infamous quirks. Every shot reloaded itself through recoil. It was ugly genius, the kind that only reveals itself through madness. By dawn, Jeffress had his sketch completed, a rough design of a weapon that looked like nothing else on Earth. It was heavy, awkward, and dangerous, but in his hands, it was hope made metal. For the first time since the Panzers had begun their reign of terror, a British infantryman might stand his ground and strike back. As Jeffress looked at the smoking wreckage of yet another test bomb, he smiled wearily. "If the world's gone mad," he muttered, "then it needs mad weapons." When Jeffress finally brought his creation before the higher-ups, the room smelled faintly of burned metal and skepticism. A dozen officers in crisp uniforms stood around the table, staring down at what looked more like a plumbing pipe with a trigger than a weapon of war. The silence was thick. Someone coughed. Then, in the kind of tone reserved for lunatics and children, one of them asked, "Major, you intend for men to fire this thing?" Jeffress stood straight, his face expressionless. "Yes, sir," he said quietly, "and with it, they'll be able to kill a tank." The room broke into uneasy laughter. One officer chuckled so hard his monocle slipped. Another leaned in and tapped the steel casing with his knuckle. "You mean to tell me this spring-loaded stovepipe is going to stop a Panzer?" Jeffress said nothing. He simply lifted the weapon, heavy, awkward, and pointed it at an empty corner of the room. The officers instinctively stepped back. There was something unsettling about his confidence, something in his eyes that said he's either right or insane. In the following weeks, the skepticism hardened into bureaucratic stone. Procurement committees delayed funding. Test ranges denied him time. Factory managers refused to divert materials for something so experimental. Even fellow engineers whispered that Jeffress was wasting precious resources. The ministry had 1,000 priorities, and a mad spring gun wasn't one of them. He tried every channel he could. He wrote reports, built diagrams, even filmed short test reels showing the weapon's potential. But each time he hit the same wall, disbelief. The problem wasn't just technical, it was psychological. Britain's military elite believed in tradition, rifles, bayonets, artillery, tanks. A weapon that worked more like a catapult than a gun was too alien, too unorthodox. It offended their sense of order. But Jeffress was stubborn. He'd built his career on being impossible to ignore. When the official route failed, he went around it straight to the top. He requested a demonstration for Churchill's personal liaison. The Prime Minister's staff agreed, half out of curiosity, half because they'd learned never to underestimate a man from Churchill toy shop. On a grey morning, at a remote firing range, Jeffress stood beside a sandbag wall, the strange contraption slung over his shoulder like a medieval relic. When the countdown began, even his own team held their breath. No one was entirely sure if the thing would fire or explode in his hands. Jeffress didn't flinch. He aimed at an old German tank hull set up 70 yards away. The spring groaned, the air vibrated, and with a brutal THWMP, the weapon spat fire. A second later, the bomb slammed into the armor, detonating with a shuddering crack. When the dust cleared, a fist-sized hole smoked in the tank's plating. No one spoke for a moment, then someone muttered, "Bloody hell." Word traveled fast. Some called it luck, others witchcraft, but most still didn't trust it. The weapon kicked so hard it could break ribs, the reload was awkward, the spring terrifyingly stiff, and worst of all, misfires were deadly. "You'd need nerves of steel to use it," said one tester, "or no brains at all." Jeffress didn't argue. He knew what he was asking, that soldiers would have to face tanks head-on with a weapon that could kill them as easily as their enemy. But he also knew something else. Courage isn't born from comfort, it's born from desperation. And by 1943, the British infantry had plenty of that. When final approval came down, it wasn't triumphant. It was quiet, reluctant, almost resentful. The War Office approved limited production. Officially, it would be called the Projector, Infantry, Anti-Tank, the PIAT, a name so dull it sounded like an afterthought. But Jeffress knew better. He built a monster. And soon, soldiers across Europe would discover what that meant. For now, though, he walked home through the rain, exhausted and hollow-eyed. The weapon that no one believed in was finally real. But the real test, the one written in blood and mud, was still waiting across the channel. The first time a PIAT was fired in the field, no one trusted it, not even the men ordered to use it. The weapon had arrived at training camps in plain wooden crates marked experimental ordnance. Inside was a crude instruction sheet, a handful of awkward bombs, and a weapon so heavy and strange that soldiers joked it was half tank, half mousetrap. Its weight, nearly 35 pounds, made it a nightmare to carry. Its spring had to be cocked by lying on your back, feet braced, hauling the weapon upright with both arms until it clicked. "If the Jerrys don't kill you," one corporal muttered, the bloody PIAT will. Yet orders were orders. By summer 1943, the weapon was issued to select infantry platoons for field testing. Somewhere in North Africa, under a sun that scorched the sand and metal alike, a small British detachment prepared to try it in combat for the first time. Dust clung to everything: uniforms, rifles, and the odd green tubes that no one quite understood. The men passed the PIAT around like it was cursed, daring one another to fire it first. Private Tom Hudson, a mechanic from Leeds, drew the short straw. He'd never seen a tank up close, let alone faced one with nothing but a spring gun. When the German Panzer Mark III appeared on the horizon, black smoke trailing behind it, its turret scanning the dunes, Hudson felt his insides turn to ice. He could hear the grind of its treads, see the shimmer of heat on its armor. The PIAT felt absurdly small in his hands, like a child's toy against a god of war. He remembered the training officer's words: "Get within 100 yards, aim low, pray." That was it. That was the manual. Hudson crawled forward, the sand hot enough to burn through his sleeves, until the Panzer loomed close, too close. He could see the faces of the German crew through the vision slit. The ground shook beneath him. His comrades held their breath. He braced the PIAT on a rock, yanked the trigger, and the weapon came alive with a violent metallic shriek. The spring slammed forward, the bomb screamed through the air, and for a heartbeat nothing happened. Then a thunderclap. The warhead struck the tank's side and burst into a blossom of fire and steel. The Panzer shuddered, tracks grinding, then stopped dead. A second later, its hatch burst open and smoke poured out. Hudson sat there, stunned, his ears ringing. The men around him erupted into cheers, half in triumph, half in disbelief. They'd done it. A single infantryman had stopped a tank, alone, without artillery, without armor support. The impossible had just happened. The PIAT had spoken, and its voice was vengeance. But victory came with a price. The recoil had slammed Hudson backward, bruising his shoulder and nearly breaking his collarbone. The weapon had almost killed him in the process. Later, as they inspected the wreckage, one officer muttered, "Clever thing, if it doesn't blow you to bits first." That became the PIAT's reputation from then on: brutal, dangerous, but undeniably effective. Back in Britain, when Jeffress received the field report, he read it twice, then 3 times. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just sat there staring at the paper, at the line that said, "One Panzer destroyed by single infantryman using PIAT." The words felt heavier than the weapon itself. Years of ridicule, risk, and sleepless nights had led to this single moment of vindication. But Jeffress also knew what it meant. Men were going to die testing his creation, learning its quirks, facing monsters with nothing but his machine between them. Still, he whispered to himself, "It works." That was all he'd ever wanted. A mad idea made real, a weapon born from defiance. In that instant, far from the battlefield, he closed his eyes and imagined the sound of that first explosion, not as death, but as proof that even in the darkest hours of war, invention could roar louder than fear. By the time the PIAT reached Europe in significant numbers, the war had shifted into its bloodiest gear. The Allies were preparing for their greatest gamble, the invasion of occupied France, and every infantry division was desperate for a weapon that could level the playing field against German armor. The brass still distrusted the PIAT, but field reports couldn't be ignored anymore. From Sicily to Italy, British soldiers were whispering the same thing: "It works." Yet the PIAT remained a paradox, loved and hated in equal measure. It was clumsy, unpredictable, and heavy as sin. Soldiers cursed it in the field, calling it a mule that bites. But when the tanks rolled in, they clung to it like a lifeline. Each success story spread like wildfire through the ranks, retold around campfires in hushed tones. A single PIAT team knocked out a tiger near Salerno. A corporal took down a half-track from 50 yards. Every tale turned fear into faith, and faith, in war, is more powerful than steel. One night in 1943, during the Italian campaign, that faith would be tested like never before. A small British unit was pinned down near the village of San Salvo, trapped by a German Panzer IV shelling the ruins they were hiding in. Ammunition was low. The radio was dead. The tank's gun methodically tore the building apart, one shell at a time. Lying in the dust and darkness was Lance Corporal Ernest "Smudger" Smith, a quiet man from London's East End who'd never considered himself particularly brave. At his side, one PIAT launcher, one bomb. As the walls shook and men yelled for cover, Smith crawled forward. The others thought he'd lost his mind. The tank's machine guns swept the street, cutting down anything that moved. But Smith kept going, dragging the PIAT, grunting with effort. He found a crater, knelt inside, and waited. The Panzer rolled closer, its engine growling like some mechanical beast sniffing for prey. When its shadow fell over the crater, Smith raised the PIAT and aimed at the black belly of the tank. He fired. The weapon bucked so violently it nearly threw him backward, but the bomb struck true, slamming into the tank's underside and detonating with a roaring explosion. The Panzer's tracks snapped, fire pouring from its hatches. The monster shuddered to a stop, its crew spilling out, burning. Smith reloaded, trembling, and hit them again. Silence followed, the kind that only comes after a storm. When the smoke cleared, the men emerged, stunned. The tank was gone, the road was theirs. Later, Smith would downplay the moment in his report, calling it a lucky shot. His commanders disagreed. For that act, he was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor in the British Empire. His weapon, the PIAT. News of Smith's valor spread across Europe like a spark through dry grass. It changed something intangible, the way soldiers thought about fighting tanks. The PIAT, once mocked as suicide in a tube, was becoming a symbol of grit and defiance. It wasn't perfect. It misfired, it bruised, it terrified its users, but it worked. And in the trenches, that was all that mattered. Back in Britain, Jeffries finally received the dispatch with Smith's name on it. He read the words slowly, tracing the lines of the citation with trembling fingers. His invention, his madness, had helped one man stand up to a tank and win. That night, for the first time in years, Jeffries allowed himself to smile, not the smile of pride, but of relief. The gamble had paid off. And somewhere in the blacked-out sky above London, as the city still healed from its own scars, the faint echo of that battlefield roar seemed to whisper through the air, proof that one stubborn idea could change the very physics of fear. By the spring of 1944, Europe was a coiled spring ready to explode. The Allied invasion of France loomed, a storm gathering strength in the shadows. In every bunker, in every training field, the air hummed with tension and secrecy. Operation Overlord, the greatest amphibious assault in history, would rely not just on numbers or air power, but on the courage of the men who would land first, infantry who would face German steel head-on. And in their hands, among rifles, grenades, and shovels, would be the most unlikely weapon of all, the PIAT. Factories across Britain worked in near silence behind blackout curtains, stamping out thousands of the odd, heavy launchers. The weapons were assembled by workers who barely understood what they were building, women and young men threading monstrous springs into steel tubes, tightening bolts, checking triggers. The sound of those springs being wound, the metallic groan and snap, became the heartbeat of an invisible army. Every weapon packed into crates was another promise that infantry would not be helpless when the tanks came. Dark, rain-soaked training fields across southern England, soldiers practiced with them endlessly. The drills became rituals of fear and faith. A private would kneel, brace the weapon on his shoulder, and fire at a wrecked tank hull, the explosion lighting up the fog. The others would cheer, even though they knew it might fail the next time. Instructors barked, cocked and loaded, "Lads, if it jams, fix bayonets, but never turn your back on a tank again." The laughter that followed was nervous, defiant, electric. Inside the War Office, a quiet transformation was taking place. The old generals who had once mocked Jeffries's contraption were now whispering its name with cautious respect. Reports from the Italian front, from Tunisia, from the Anzio beachhead, all told the same story. The PIAT worked where courage met desperation. Infantry units that had once scattered at the sound of approaching armor now dug in and waited. The weapon was rewriting the psychology of battle. Jeffries, now a weary man with more gray in his hair than years in his face, watched from the shadows of his laboratory. He no longer needed to argue for his invention. It had found its way to the front lines and into legend. But he knew the hardest test was yet to come. Normandy would be the crucible. The beaches would be chaos, machine guns, mortars, fire. Could the PIAT, his stubborn miracle, survive that storm? Could it help men face tanks in the open sand? He barely slept, haunted by the weight of what he'd created. As D-Day approached, special training manuals were rushed out. They showed how to use the PIAT from trenches, from windows, even from the prone position. "Wait until you can see the whites of their eyes or the grease on their treads," one line read grimly. Soldiers gave the weapon nicknames: the Beast, the Spring Monster, the Brits' Revenge. Despite its flaws, they trusted it because they had no choice. The PIAT wasn't just a tool. It was a promise that even the smallest man could strike back at the invincible. On the eve of June 5, 1944, under a moon smothered by clouds, crates of PIATs were quietly loaded into landing craft along with rifles, rations, and dreams of liberation. The sea air was cold and sharp. Officers moved between rows of men whispering last-minute orders, but the soldiers barely listened. They cleaned their weapons, checked the fuses, adjusted straps. A few knelt to pray, not for victory, but for courage. Somewhere in that dark tide, a young corporal ran his hand along the cold steel of his PIAT and muttered, "You and me, old boy. Let's show them what the Brits are made of." The waves slapped against the boats like drums, the engines roared to life, and with them, a new kind of defiance. The plan was in motion. The world was about to change. The ramp fell, and the world erupted. Landing craft spat men onto a beach that looked like the mouth of hell, smoke clawing at the low clouds, tracers stitching the air, and the sharp metallic tang of cordite and seaweed. Men slid down ropes into waist-deep water and ran, lungs burning, boots swallowing sand. Amid that chaos, the PIAT felt absurdly small and yet unbearably heavy, a private's talisman against machines that seemed born of thunder. Soldiers who had only ever seen the weapon in training now shouldered it into a storm, hands trembling, heartbeats drum-quick under flak jackets as they crawled toward a line of monstrous shapes cutting across the foreshore. German armored vehicles, glinting and waiting like predators behind broken concrete and hedgerows. The first time the PIAT sang under direct enemy fire on D-Day, it did not do so elegantly. A landing party, pinned behind a collapsed steel caisson, watched a half-track ease along the causeway, its machine gun stitching the air with hateful rhythm. Corporal James "Jem" Hargreaves, a baker by trade who smelled more of flour than war, labored forward, sand digging into his palms. He felt foolish, a man with a spring gun against a vehicle bristling with men and metal, but courage is a muscle that grows in use. He braced, felt the spring roar like a caged beast, and fired. The projectile flew in a low, ugly arc and struck the near side of the half-track with a staccato roar. The explosion threw men and metal apart. For a heartbeat, nothing moved, then the half-track lurched, burning, and the firing line broke long enough for Jem's mates to scramble through. In that instant, a beachhead was bought with a single, punishing blast. Elsewhere, the PIAT became a whispered secret among assault teams. Men learned to use ruins like gunports, to wait in the teeth of the storm until armor came into the deadly sweet spot, 30 to 70 yards, and then to pull the trigger with the kind of hands that know what fear costs. The weapon was messy. It misfired in the mud. It kicked like an angry beast and left bruises long after the war, but it gave men choice: stand and fight, or run and survive. That choice in the minute between a tank's sighting and its arrival was everything. Stories multiplied: a sergeant who took out 2 Stu-GS from a ruined farmhouse roof, an infantryman who rolled into a ditch and fired through a broken embrasure, taking the tracks out of a Panzer's approach and saving a whole company from annihilation. Each account added to a growing mythology that underpinned courage on the field. Sound on that day was a study in contrast: the high whine of shells, the dull thump of impacts, the whispered prayers of men pressed to metal. The PIAT's reports were short, savage bursts that cut through the din, less polished than a cannon, but brutal and final. When a shaped charge detonated against armor, it made a terrible, intimate sound, metal screaming, splinters snapping, the hollow cough as internal components gave way. Soldiers saw the result up close: hatches ripped like tin lids, engine blocks thrown open, the black plume of fuel and oil igniting into a small, contained hell. Sometimes a tank smoked and burned for only a moment before going silent. Other times, it shuddered and moved on, wounded but alive. Each outcome taught hard lessons about angles, distance, and the mercy of good aim. The PIAT's limitations were carved into the bodies and souls of the men who used it. You had to be close. You had to be brave. You had to be willing to be the pig in a pen while the weapon did its work. There were nights in Normandy when entire squads sat beside shattered tanks, trading cigarettes and stories, celebrating narrow survivals and mourning friends who had been blown clear by a recall or swallowed by a misfire. The weapon did not spare them from grief. It delivered victories that tasted of ash and loss. A soldier who had taken down an armored car might be carried off later with shrapnel in his lungs. The same blast that saved a platoon could take the loader who misjudged the wind. War is not tidy, and the PIAT made that truth undeniable. But for all its ugliness, the PIAT altered tactics in small, decisive ways. Infantry no longer fled from armor by default. They learned to bait and ambush, to drive tanks into kill zones among hedgerows and ruined walls where a PIAT operator could find the underside or the thin side armor. Engineers began to move with assault teams, laying traps and clearing fields so men could get inside the armor's blind spots. Radio calls changed. A shout of PIAT on the line meant a renewed chance, the possibility of turning the enemy's advantage into their own. Platoons that had been dispersed and demoralized found a new backbone in the weapon's grim promise. Even the biggest machine had its vulnerable heart. And then there were the moments of collective astonishment, when multiple PIATs struck together and a German armored column stalled and then collapsed like a fallen beast. Those scenes became almost cinematic, a rising column of smoke, the stunned faces of crews climbing out, the silent, awful recognition that the old rules of armored supremacy no longer applied everywhere. German officers who had once counted on mechanized terror found themselves meeting stubborn, angry humans who had learned a small, brutal calculus: close, aim low, and fire. Those tactical shifts didn't win the war alone, but they eroded the Wehrmacht's certainty and saved lives by giving infantry back a measure of agency. By dusk, Normandy's sands were littered with blackened hulks and ragged men leaning on each other. The PIAT, with all its mischief and menace, had earned a place in the grim theater of that blood-soaked day. It did not make war noble. It did not spare the losses, but it gave ordinary men a way to say no to the inevitability of steel, to stand, to fight, and sometimes, impossibly, to win. As night crept over the invasion beaches, the last fires still burned, and soldiers settled down in foxholes with the weight of the metal by their side. The machine had been unleashed. Now its users would learn its full cost. When news of what had happened on the beaches of Normandy began filtering back across the channel, it came in fragments, coded messages, garbled radio chatter, half-burned dispatches. But there was one phrase that kept appearing again and again, tucked between the chaos and confusion: PIAT successful. It was written with disbelief, almost as if the word itself defied logic. In offices where men in uniform had once laughed the idea out of the room, the reports landed like thunder. Enemy armor disabled by infantry at point-blank range. Tanks destroyed by foot soldiers who refused to retreat. German crews abandoning vehicles in panic when a single British soldier appeared from smoke with a PIAT on his shoulder. The impossible had become reality, and it sent a shockwave through every echelon of command. In the War Office, officers who had once treated Jeffries like a nuisance now crowded around maps, redrawing lines with trembling hands. Dispatches from field commanders confirmed the same impossible pattern. Wherever the PIAT appeared, the morale of infantry soared, and the myth of German invincibility cracked. Generals who had once sworn that only heavy artillery could stop tanks now spoke in hushed tones about portable armor deterrence. They began calculating not just the tonnage of shells, but the number of men who could carry defiance on their backs. The German High Command, for its part, was equally stunned. Reports from frontline units described infantry armed with a strange spring device capable of penetrating Panzer armor. Incredulous officers dismissed it at first, another field exaggeration from panicked tank crews. But soon, too many wrecks appeared, too many accounts of sudden explosions from unseen enemies. Wehrmacht intelligence finally issued a notice to all armored units. The British possess a new anti-tank weapon of small size and high effectiveness. Approach infantry with caution. The fear of the unknown began to spread faster than the weapon itself. At the front, German tank crews grew jumpy. Once, they had advanced with a predator's confidence, the sound of their treads alone enough to scatter infantry. Now they hesitated, Every hedge, every ruined wall, every silent farmhouse could hide a man with a PIAT. The very psychology of the battlefield began to tilt. What was once a one-sided terror had become a duel of nerves. Tank commanders ordered their gunners to shell empty fields just to be safe. Whole columns slowed down, stalling advances that had once rolled like clockwork. Fear, that most human of weapons, had changed sides. Among the Allied ranks, the transformation was just as profound. Soldiers began to carry themselves differently, not as prey, but as hunters. The PIAT gave them a strange, defiant confidence. It wasn't just about the destruction it could cause, it was the symbol it carried. Here was proof that innovation, born in desperation and mocked into existence, could shift the balance of war. When infantry patrols marched through liberated villages, children and civilians would sometimes see the odd, stubby weapon slung across a soldier's back and ask, "What is that?" And the soldier would grin, slap the steel tube, and say, "That's the thing that scared the tanks away." Back in Britain, newspapers began to whisper of new secret weapons turning the tide. The truth was censored, the details classified, but the tone was triumphant. Quietly within the Ministry of Supply, a small team gathered to send word to the man who had made it possible. In a memo to Jeffries, one official wrote, "Your device has proven invaluable in the field. Infantry morale owes much to your persistence." It was bureaucratic language for something far deeper: vindication. The man once called a crank had, through sheer stubbornness, given men a way to fight back against fear itself. But Jeffries didn't celebrate. When the reports reached him, he sat alone in his cluttered office, reading the accounts of victories and losses alike. For every tank destroyed, there were men who hadn't come back. The weapon had worked, but at a terrible cost. He understood something few others did, that every great invention in war carried a debt in blood. The PIAT had not made war less cruel. It had merely leveled the cruelty, given the powerless a fighting chance. Still, that small measure of equality, he thought, might just be enough to change history. Within weeks, Allied intelligence began intercepting German communications that spoke of new British Devil's spring guns. The enemy was rattled, and in their panic, they began diverting precious resources to reinforce tank armor and develop countermeasures. In a war of logistics, that ripple mattered more than any single battle. Every ton of steel diverted to thicker armor meant fewer planes, fewer artillery shells, fewer supplies for the crumbling front. The psychological victory was as valuable as the tactical one. In a matter of months, the PIAT had gone from a ridiculed prototype to a weapon that reshaped the tempo of war. It had humbled the mighty, empowered the ordinary, and proven that sometimes the most improbable idea, born in the mind of a man too stubborn to give up, could shake empires. The shockwave of that realization rippled through every command post, every factory, every soldier's heart. War had changed once again, and the world would never look at courage or invention quite the same way. The full weight of the PIAT's legacy revealed itself not in laboratories or war rooms, but in muddy foxholes, bombed-out villages, and the trembling hands of soldiers who had survived impossible odds. In the weeks following D-Day, Allied progress through Normandy was a grinding, brutal affair, hedgerow to hedgerow, street to street. German tanks, once symbols of unstoppable might, found themselves stalked by shadows. Every hedge might conceal a man with a spring-loaded monster. Every barn could hold a PIAT crew waiting for the right moment. The psychological tide had turned. The terror that once belonged to the infantry now haunted the steel beasts that once dominated them. Commanders began to notice the difference almost immediately. Reports flooded in of small units repelling armored counterattacks without the aid of artillery. A squad of 6 men, armed with a single PIAT, halted a Panther column near Villers-Bocage long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Another platoon, cornered in a Norman orchard, destroyed 3 half-tracks and forced a company of SS troops to retreat. These weren't isolated miracles. They were the new rhythm of modern warfare, proof that courage armed with innovation could shift the odds even against overwhelming force. For the first time, infantry could move without the constant dread of being crushed under tank treads. Soldiers began to write home about it, letters smudged with dirt and sweat. "They rolled in with those great beasts again," one wrote, "and we waited." When they were close enough to see their eyes through the slit, Tommy fired the PIAT. The whole thing went up. "Never thought I'd cheer for a spring." There was humor in the horror now, the kind of gallows laughter that soldiers used to survive the unimaginable, but behind the jokes lay something profound, faith restored. The tactical implications were enormous. With the PIAT in play, Allied strategists no longer had to rely exclusively on airstrikes or heavy guns to break armored defenses. Infantry could spearhead advances, clearing routes for vehicles instead of the other way around. It changed how armies moved, how they thought. It meant flexibility, and flexibility meant life. The PIAT was no longer just a weapon. It was a symbol of adaptability, of British ingenuity meeting the cold machinery of war and daring it to blink first. In London, military analysts began tracing the weapon's influence on the battlefield's tempo. Where PIATs were deployed in large numbers, German armor suffered greater losses and morale fell faster. The weapon's unpredictability, its ability to appear anywhere, fired by anyone, had introduced chaos into the meticulously structured German war machine. Field reports described entire panzer units moving more cautiously, slowing their advances, wasting fuel, and losing momentum. Time, the one resource Hitler could not replenish, was being stolen minute by men with spring-loaded defiance in their hands. The Allies recognized this shift with growing awe. American observers embedded with British units took notes, reporting back to Washington that the British portable anti-tank launcher, though crude in design, exhibits effectiveness far beyond its appearance. The Americans had their bazooka, a sleeker, rocket-powered marvel, but even they admitted the PIAT's brute simplicity had advantages. It required no backblast, no rockets, no fragile tubes. It could be fired from inside a building, from a foxhole, from behind a broken wall. Its ammunition was cheap, its courage priceless. Perhaps the greatest impact of all was invisible, the one that lived inside the men who carried it. The PIAT made them believe that bravery could still outthink terror, that even when the world was divided between giants and pawns, there was room for defiance. Soldiers who had once seen tanks as death sentences began to treat them as challenges. This change in mindset rippled far beyond the battlefield. It reaffirmed something the war had almost crushed, that technology, when wielded by the ordinary, could reclaim dignity from despair. By late 1944, as the Allies pushed through France into Belgium, Jeffress's invention had achieved something no one had imagined when it was first mocked in secret meetings. It had restored equilibrium. The PIAT hadn't just pierced armor, it had punctured the mythology of invincibility. And in doing so, it gave rise to a new kind of warfare, one where innovation was measured not by sophistication, but by will. In the end, that was its truest legacy, proof that when the odds are impossible, the human spirit finds a way to fight back, even if that means pulling back a steel spring and aiming at the impossible. By the spring of 1945, the thunder of tanks had faded into a distant echo. Europe was a graveyard of machines, twisted metal carcasses littering roads, fields, and towns. In the aftermath of the war's end, as soldiers packed up, prisoners were liberated, and flags changed hands, the PIAT, that ugly, awkward contraption, began to vanish from the headlines. It had done its work. It had been the slingshot against the armored Goliaths, and now it was being quietly retired, replaced by smoother, lighter, and more modern weapons. But for those who had fired it in the dark, the PIAT was no relic. It was a memory that clung to the smell of smoke, the recoil in the shoulder, the sound of steel screaming under impact. In camps scattered across a broken continent, soldiers shared stories as they waited to go home. They talked of the battles that would haunt them, the faces they'd never forget, and somewhere between the laughter and the silence, someone would bring up the PIAT. There was always a mix of respect and resentment in their tone. It was heavy, temperamental, and bruised you like a mule, but it had saved lives. It was a bastard to use, one veteran said years later, but when it worked, it made you feel like you could take on the whole damn German army. The others nodded, the kind of nod only men who have faced death together can give. Many of those who had carried it never returned. Their names filled the lists pinned to church doors and local newspapers back home, quiet towns that would never be quite the same. For the families of those men, the weapon existed only as rumor or legend, mentioned in a letter or recalled by a comrade who survived. He stood his ground with that thing, a friend might say at a funeral, and that was all. the PIAT had been their brother's last companion. In the personal tragedies of war, it became a ghost, both a cause of and answer to death. For Jeffress, victory brought no celebration. When the war ended, he was a tired man, worn down by years of secrecy and skepticism. He'd seen his creation turn the tide of battles, but he'd also read too many after-action reports listing the men who died using it. He walked through his laboratory one final time, past the tables where prototypes had exploded, past the blackboards filled with equations that had once been dismissed as fantasy, and packed his papers away. He never sought glory. The PIAT had never been about fame. It was about necessity, about giving ordinary men a chance when they had none. Still, when he turned off the lights that last evening, he could not escape one haunting truth. His invention had made killing more equal, but not more human. Across the continent, thousands of PIATs were collected, stacked in piles, and melted down for scrap. The war machine that had demanded their birth now devoured them in peace. A few were kept in museums, others buried in warehouses. Some soldiers smuggled one home as a memento, a forbidden trophy, a steel reminder of the day they refused to run. Those who did found themselves haunted by it. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of the worst and best in mankind, the drive to survive, to innovate, to endure. As peace settled like dust, the world moved on to newer wars and newer weapons. Rockets replaced springs. Precision replaced guesswork. The names changed, bazooka, Panzerfaust, law, but the spirit was the same. Somewhere inside every guided missile and armor-piercing round was the echo of that crude British device, born in desperation, wielded in defiance. The men who had once prayed over its temperamental spring now found themselves back in quiet villages, working farms, fixing engines. Raising children who would never know what it meant to face a tank at 30 yards, with nothing but a tube and a prayer. And yet in the quiet of those post-war years, there was a strange peace that came with remembering. The PIAT, in all its awkward glory, had proven that even in a world consumed by machines, humanity still mattered. The courage to pull the trigger, the will to stand your ground, the refusal to surrender to inevitability. That was its true legacy, not the steel or the spring, but the spirit that wielded it. When Jeffress passed away in 1963, there were no parades, no medals pinned for his stubborn brilliance. But somewhere, in the hearts of the men who had lived because of him, there lingered a quiet gratitude for the engineer who gave them a fighting chance when the world had written them off. Time, more ruthless than war, has a way of sanding the edges off history. By the 1950s, the PIAT, once a symbol of defiance and survival, had faded into the background noise of progress. The jet age was dawning. Missiles were being tested in deserts, and scientists spoke of wars fought with buttons, not blood. In glossy military journals, sleek new weapons gleamed under studio lights, while the old spring-loaded brute that had stood between men and tanks gathered dust in forgotten armories. The world was already forgetting the weapon that had changed how soldiers fought and lived. For decades, history books gave the PIAT only a few passing lines. A British anti-tank weapon used during World War II. Cold, clinical, stripped of the fear, courage, and madness that had given it meaning. Even in museums, it sat behind glass, mute and misunderstood, a relic too odd to be heroic, too crude to be celebrated. Tourists would pass by its squat frame, their eyes drawn instead to the massive tanks towering beside it. Irony lingered there. The machine that had humbled giants was now dwarfed by them once again. But among veterans, the story never truly died. In smoky British pubs and veterans' halls, the memories lived on in jokes, half-truths, and whispered reverence. "You never forgot the kick," one old soldier would say, laughing through his pipe smoke. "You fired it once and knew you done something extraordinary or something stupid or both." Another would nod, eyes distant. "It saved my mates. That's all that matters." The weapon had been a shared secret among men who had learned what desperation felt like and what it meant to defy it. Historians, too, would later begin to rediscover its significance. In dusty archives, researchers stumbled upon old Ministry of Supply documents, field reports, and Jeffress's notebooks filled with scribbles, sketches, and equations. They realized that the PIAT wasn't just a weapon, it was a turning point in design philosophy. It had pioneered the shaped charge, a concept that became the foundation of nearly every modern anti-tank, and anti-armor system. The strange little spring gun had sown the seeds for the bazooka, the RPG, the law, the AT-4, and the countless shoulder-fired systems that would follow. Its spirit lived on in every soldier who dared to stand up to steel. In the 1980s and 1990s, as surviving WWAI veterans aged into their twilight years, a few documentaries began to revisit the forgotten oddity. Old black-and-white footage resurfaced, grainy clips of soldiers firing the PIAT from trenches, its spring clanging like thunder. Historians interviewed the last men who remembered how it felt. One, his voice trembling with age, said simply, "It was the ugliest thing I ever loved." That sentence, more than any report or record, captured the heart of it. The PIAT was never elegant, but neither was courage. By the 21st century, military scholars began to connect the dots. The PIAT had been ahead of its time, a weapon born out of scarcity that embodied a timeless truth. Innovation doesn't always come from brilliance alone. It comes from fear, necessity, and the refusal to give up. Jeffress's Mad Spring had been a prototype for human stubbornness itself, proof that sometimes the crude solution is the right one, because it works when it must. The principles it demonstrated, simplicity, portability, self-contained power, are still embedded in the DNA of modern warfare. Today, if you walk into the Imperial War Museum in London and stand before one of the surviving PIATs, you can almost hear its story humming beneath the glass. Not the story of steel or springs, but of the men who trusted it, the ones who dug in their heels on the beaches, who aimed at the impossible, and who fired because retreat was no longer an option. Few visitors stop long enough to understand that they're looking at one of the most extraordinary symbols of wartime ingenuity ever built. The PIAT's legacy is not in medals or monuments. It lives in the quiet truth that the powerless can defy power, that courage, coupled with invention, can alter the course of history. The world may have forgotten its name, but its echo lives on in every modern soldier who shoulders a weapon and faces a machine that should, by all logic, destroy him. The spring that once shuddered to life in Jeffress's workshop still vibrates through the conscience of innovation, a reminder that necessity, not perfection, wins wars. The battlefield is silent now. The guns have long since rusted, the tanks sit in museums, and the men who once held their ground beneath the roar of engines are mostly gone. But if you close your eyes and listen, really listen, you can still hear it. The snap of a spring, the echo of defiance, the heartbeat of a moment when ordinary men refused to yield. That sound, that defiant pulse, was the sound of the PIAT, a weapon that embodied everything fragile and indestructible about the human spirit. In the grand theater of war, it was never meant to be beautiful. It was awkward, brutal, and dangerous to the very men who used it. But that was the point. The PIAT was human, imperfect, stubborn, full of flaws and fury, and somehow that made it extraordinary. It wasn't born from privilege or comfort. It came from desperation, from a world on the brink, from men who refused to accept that courage had become obsolete. And when they pulled that trigger, they weren't just firing a weapon, they were firing back at fate itself. When we look at the Second World War, we often focus on the grand strategies, the sweeping movements of armies, the speeches and leaders. But beneath all of that were individuals, the engineers who refused to quit, the soldiers who refused to run, the quiet acts of resistance that bent history's direction by inches. The story of the PIAT is one of those acts, a reminder that ingenuity doesn't always wear medals, and heroism doesn't always carry a rifle. Sometimes it carries a spring. Jeffress never lived to see the full acknowledgement of what his invention meant. But in every weapon that came after, in every tool that allowed a single soldier to stand up to a tank, to defy the impossible, there is a whisper of his work. He taught the world something profound, that power isn't just about size or might, it's about imagination and the will to make the impossible practical. His weapon didn't just pierce armor, it pierced arrogance and rewrote the equation of fear. And for the men who used it, men like Hargreaves on the beaches of Normandy, or the countless unnamed infantrymen who fired it in the mud, smoke, and terror, the PIAT wasn't just steel and springs, it was courage made tangible. They didn't wait for reinforcements. They didn't surrender to the inevitability of armor. They stood, braced their shoulders and said, "Not today." Those moments, multiplied 1,000 times across the front, are the true legacy of the weapon, not its statistics, not its schematics, but the courage it demanded and the courage it gave. History remembers the tanks. It remembers the generals, the invasions, the grand victories, but it often forgets the quiet revolutions, the moments when a handful of men, armed with nothing but belief and ingenuity, changed the balance of the world. The PIAT was one of those revolutions. It didn't just save lives, it changed how those lives were lived, how men saw themselves in the face of terror. It proved that fear could be fought with imagination, and that no machine, no matter how mighty, was invincible before human resolve. And so, as the story closes, as the smoke clears and time rolls on, we are left with one truth that transcends war itself. Innovation is born from courage, and courage from the refusal to surrender. The PIAT may now be silent, its spring forever still, but its echo continues in every act of human defiance, every invention born from necessity, every time someone looks at an impossible problem and says, "Let's try anyway." History remembers the battles, but not the men who dared to dream inside the fire.